He lived years in the shadows, fearful of every siren, every knock at the door. But when he finally decided to fight for a dignified life, a simple, broken taillight almost destroyed everything. Diego knew he could lose it all in seconds, until love and unexpected courage changed his destiny forever. Diego arrived in Los Angeles on a September afternoon with a broken suitcase, a backpack on his shoulder, and a heart full of dreams. He was 23 years old, had a 4-year student visa, and the conviction that with hard work he could turn his destiny around. He left behind his parents, a younger brother who always looked up to him, and a Mexico where opportunities were as scarce as water in the hills where he grew up. If you like interesting stories, give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell to not miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. We'd love to hear from you. During his first years, Diego devoted himself completely to his civil engineering studies at a community college. He learned English out of necessity, combining morning classes with shifts at the library cafeteria in the afternoons. It wasn't easy, but every early morning, every washed dish, every learned formula brought him closer to what he called a life with a future. And that future seemed within reach. When after 5 years, one extra for changing his major halfway through, Diego received his diploma. He held it in his hands as if it were pure gold. It was proof that it had all been worth it. However, the happiness was short-lived. His visa expired 3 months after graduation, and with it all the legal options he had to stay vanished. He tried applying for a work visa, but the conditions were strict and employers weren't willing to sponsor him. He consulted with a lawyer, but the fees were unaffordable for someone barely surviving on sporadic food delivery gigs. Returning to Mexico wasn't an option, not after everything he had sacrificed, not after seeing how far he had come. He knew there were no projects, no jobs, no hopes of practicing his career there. Staying illegally, although it scared him, seemed to be the only way to keep fighting. That's how his new life began. A life without papers, without protections, without rights. The first months after the visa expired were the hardest. Diego stopped doing simple things he once took for granted, going to the bank, visiting a doctor, entering a government building. He moved to a shared apartment in South Central with 3 other Mexicans who were in the same situation. They agreed not to talk too much about their pasts or their plans. The important thing was to survive, to stay under the radar. He got a job on a construction crew. His boss had known him since his student days and agreed to hire him without questions. The pay was in cash, under the table, no insurance, no job security. Diego accepted without thinking twice, carrying cement bags, climbing scaffolds, mixing concrete under the scorching sun. All of that was preferable to returning empty-handed. Weeks passed, then months. The illegal life wrapped around him like a thick fog. Every day was like the one before. He woke up before dawn, worked until sunset, and returned to the apartment with his body aching and his soul empty. There was no time to dream. There was only time to endure. The worst part wasn't the exhaustion. The worst was the fear. That fear that grew with every news story, every raid, every tale of someone detained for a simple traffic violation and deported within days. Diego learned to avoid police, to ignore any form of authority. If he saw a patrol car, he'd cross the street. If he heard a siren, he'd freeze. Little by little, he was losing his name. At work, they called him El Morro, the kid. On the fake papers he used for certain contracts, he was Miguel Rodriguez. His real identity became a secret. His past, a burden. His future, a question mark. The only thing he didn't lose was his dignity. Although he lived on the margins of the system, he never allowed himself to fall into self-pity. Every dollar he earned, he sent to his parents. Every free minute, he used to read about immigration laws, search for legal avenues, understand if there was any hope. But the system was designed to close all doors on him. And he, no matter how hard he knocked, always seemed to hit a wall. The dreams, however, were still there. Dormant, buried, but alive. He dreamed of having his own construction business, of designing houses, of saving to buy a car in his name, of being able to open a bank account without fearing someone would ask questions, of breathing peacefully. Above all, he dreamed of being able to say his real name without fear, of being able to live, not just survive. And although each passing day seemed to distance him further from that dream, Diego kept holding on, because if he had learned anything since crossing the border with his student visa, it was that papers might have expiration dates. But dreams don't. Diego got used to living without being seen. It was as if he existed in the margins, in a parallel reality where the rules were different, where every move had to be calculated and every word carefully measured. He had no right to make mistakes. In his world, an error didn't mean a fine or a scolding. It meant the end. It meant losing everything he had built and being sent back to a country that no longer felt like home. During the day, he worked on different construction sites around Los Angeles. He was punctual, responsible, and stronger than he appeared. He knew how to operate heavy machinery, mix cement in exact proportions, and build walls that would pass any inspection, even though he himself couldn't pass any. The other workers respected him, but no one asked too many questions. In that environment, talking too much could be dangerous. At the end of the workday, when the others went to drink beers or eat at some restaurant, Diego disappeared into the shadows. He walked down less traveled streets, avoided security cameras, and when he got home, closed all the curtains. He had no social media. He didn't make video calls. He paid in cash and avoided anything that could leave a trace. He lived disconnected, as if the world were an alien place. The room he rented was tiny. He had a mattress on the floor, an old chair, and a small lamp that flickered occasionally. There was no television. Sometimes he listened to the radio in a low volume, just to not forget the sound of the language. He kept his expired passport in a shoebox under the bed, along with a folder full of documents that once had validity. His student visa, his college ID, some recommendation letters. He ate little, slept poorly. Nightmares were frequent. He dreamed of immigration agents entering his house, of cold handcuffs closing on his wrists, of his parents crying on the other end of the phone. Sometimes he woke up sweating with his heart beating so hard he thought the neighbors could hear it. On the street, if a patrol car approached, he'd stop dead in his tracks. It didn't matter if he was wearing a helmet and work uniform, if his hands were full of tools. The fear was immediate. Sometimes that fear transformed into a kind of paralysis. He'd stay still, looking at the ground, waiting for them to pass by. Once, a police officer touched his shoulder in a hardware store. He was a white officer, tall, with a serious face. Diego almost collapsed inside, but the officer just wanted to ask if the screwdriver was a good price. Diego could barely nod. He didn't sleep that night. He avoided hospitals, even if he had a fever or pain. Once, he cut his palm deeply with a saw. Instead of going to the emergency room, he wrapped the wound with an old t-shirt and waited for it to heal on its own. It took weeks. He was left with an ugly, crooked scar, but he was alive and free. That was all that mattered. Sometimes he felt completely alone. He watched people pass by with their new cars, their credit cards, their documents in order, and wondered if they knew how lucky they were, if they ever felt grateful for being able to walk without fear, for being able to say their name out loud, for existing without hiding. Diego got used to the losses, to passing up opportunities because he couldn't take the risk. Once he was invited to a job interview as an engineering assistant at a small construction company. The salary was decent and the position was perfect for his experience. But the interview was in a government building. He didn't go. He tore up the paper with the address and continued working as a laborer. Another time, a friend offered to sell him a cheap car. Diego thought about it for days. But he couldn't put it in his name. He couldn't get insurance for it. He couldn't risk being stopped for a broken headlight, an expired plate, any excuse. He let the offer pass. The small things were the most painful. Not being able to send money without paying sky-high commissions. Not being able to open a bank account. Not being able to rent an apartment without depending on someone else. He lived through favors, borrowed names, verbal agreements. It was like being alive without rights. And yet he resisted. Because within all that emptiness, there was something no one had been able to take away: dignity. His dignity didn't come from papers or stamps, but from his effort, from his ability to work hard, to help others, to keep his word. Sometimes when he was alone, he'd sit on the roof of the building where he lived. From there, he could see part of the Los Angeles skyline, the lights of the skyscrapers shining in the distance. In those moments, he'd close his eyes and imagine another life. A life where he didn't have to hide, where he could walk the streets without looking over his shoulder, where he could dream again without fear waking him up. He didn't know how much longer he could live like this. He didn't know if someday a raid would come, an anonymous tip, an accident with fatal consequences. But he did know he wasn't willing to give up. Because although he lived as if he didn't exist, his desire to be free was more real than ever. And in the midst of that silent darkness, still without knowing it, he was about to find the spark that would change his destiny. Diego became an expert at hiding, not just from authorities, but also from the world. He learned to walk among people without making noise, to go unnoticed, even when working under the burning sun in downtown Los Angeles, among cranes, cement, and noise. He moved like a shadow through crowds, without looking anyone in the eye, his body always tense, as if at any moment he might have to run. Fear wasn't a passing emotion. It was a permanent state, a silent poison that settled in his chest and squeezed at every moment. Diego couldn't remember the last time he had breathed deeply. He slept little, ate out of necessity, not pleasure. Police sirens were his constant alarm. The sharp sound of a closing door gave him chills. It didn't matter how many days passed without incidents. The fear was still there, like a shadow that never left him. One night, returning from work, he saw a patrol car parked right in front of his building. It wasn't there for him. Someone in the neighborhood had reported a car theft, nothing to do with Diego, but that didn't matter. Diego froze at the corner. He couldn't move forward. He felt his heart pounding against his ribs, his forehead sweating, his legs trembling. He waited more than an hour until the patrol car left. That night he slept fully dressed, backpack ready, old passport in his pocket in case he had to run. Scenes like that repeated over and over. At the supermarket, a security guard asked to check his backpack. It was part of protocol. They did it with everyone. But for Diego, it was as if an abyss had opened beneath his feet. He had nothing illegal, not even stolen, but the possibility of having to give his real name or show fake identification left him speechless. Only after the guard checked and said, "You're good, bro," could he breathe again. Fear didn't let him love. Once he met a girl at a taqueria. Her name was Camila. She was from Zacatecas, nice, funny. They talked for weeks, had coffee, went to the movies. But when she wanted to know more about his life, his past, his situation, Diego closed off. He told her he wasn't ready for a relationship. It wasn't true. He was dying to have one, to stop being alone. But he also knew that any emotional bond could become a weakness, a door to the truth, and the truth could destroy him. The days were a routine of extreme physical effort and exhausting emotional vigilance. He checked himself every day, his clothes, his route, his body language. He had phrases rehearsed in case someone stopped him. He had fake names memorized. Sometimes, looking in the mirror, he didn't even recognize his own eyes. Who was he? What had he come for? When had he become a fugitive? But what weighed most heavily wasn't the fear of being deported. It was the fear that everything he had done wouldn't amount to anything. He had studied, worked, sacrificed everything. He had endured the distance from his family, his grandmother's death without being able to say goodbye, birthdays spent alone. He had kept going despite the pain, the silence, the loneliness, and for what? To live looking over his shoulder. His friends from the past were gone. Some had returned to Mexico voluntarily, others had been deported, others simply disappeared without a trace. Sometimes Diego thought he was the last of his generation still resisting, but he didn't feel strong. He felt broken. One afternoon, returning from work, he saw an ambulance in front of his building. One of his neighbors, another undocumented immigrant, had suffered a heart attack. No one wanted to call 911 at first, out of fear. It took more than 30 minutes for them to decide. When the paramedics arrived, it was too late. He died on the way to the hospital. Diego spent the whole night unable to sleep, with the image of the motionless body on the stretcher. That night, he understood something terrifying. Being illegal didn't just make him invisible, it made him expendable. What would happen if he disappeared tomorrow? Who would look for him? Who would tell his story? Who would mourn for him? Fear had transformed into something deeper. It was no longer just fear of being arrested. It was a constant feeling of not belonging, of being an error within a society that would never accept him. Even if he worked harder than anyone, even if he paid his taxes with borrowed numbers, even if he stayed out of trouble, it didn't matter. To many, he was just another illegal. And yet every morning he got up, put on his dusty boots, took his backpack and went out to fight. Because although fear was destroying him inside, there was something that wouldn't break. His conviction that he deserved a better life, that he wasn't wrong to dream, that all that suffering had to be worth something. What Diego didn't know was that this conviction, this tiny light that still survived within him, was about to find something unexpected, someone unexpected. And that person, without knowing it, was going to challenge everything he had built and everything he had feared. The encounter was so casual it almost seemed like a joke of destiny. One Sunday afternoon, Diego was walking through the Boyle Heights neighborhood. He had finished early at the construction site and decided to stop by a small community fair in front of a church where they sold Mexican food, crafts, and offered free health services. It was one of those events organized by local foundations where immigrants could, for a few hours, let their guard down. He didn't plan to stay, he just wanted to buy a quesadilla and go on his way. But as he approached a booth with information about legal and medical assistance, a clear, sweet voice stopped him. "Want to know how to access free services regardless of your status?" asked the young woman with a disarming smile. Diego hesitated. His first instinct was to move away, to distrust. But something in her voice, in her sincere gaze, gave him a strange sense of security. "No thanks. I'm just looking," he replied, but didn't move. She insisted gently, "We don't ask for papers. We just want to help. Many come afraid, but no one here will judge you." Her name was Emily. She was a volunteer at a non-profit organization that supported undocumented immigrants. She spoke Spanish with a slight accent, but fluently. She was Californian, daughter of a Salvadoran mother and American father. She had grown up between two cultures and decided early on to dedicate her life to serving those who, like her mother in the past, arrived in the country with nothing but fear and hope. Diego didn't plan to stay more than 5 minutes, but they talked for over an hour. Emily didn't ask intrusive questions. She listened attentively, with genuine interest. She told him about their projects, the free clinics they organized, English classes and legal workshops. She looked him in the eye as if she didn't see an undocumented person, but a man. Before leaving, Emily offered him a flyer with her office number. "If you ever need help, even just to talk," she said, "I'm here." Diego took days to decide to call her. He kept the paper in his wallet, took it out, put it back. Finally, after a particularly exhausting workday at a site where one of his co-workers was fired without pay, he dialed the number. Emily recognized him instantly. She offered to meet for coffee in a quiet place. Diego accepted with reservations, with fear, with that knot in his stomach he'd been carrying for years, but also with a small spark of curiosity and something else he didn't want to name yet. They met at a modest cafe in Lincoln Heights. They talked about everything and nothing. Emily didn't pressure him. Diego allowed himself to laugh. He told her about his childhood in Guerrero, how he arrived with a scholarship, about his jobs, his love for blueprints, for buildings, for design. Emily listened as if every word was important. She didn't interrupt him, didn't correct him, didn't look at him with pity. She looked at him with respect. The meetings became frequent, first once a week, then, without planning it, almost every day. They walked through parks, shared street tacos, talked about music, movies, life. Diego couldn't remember the last time he'd had a conversation that wasn't marked by fear. And one day, without thinking, a different smile escaped him. One he'd had buried for years. Emily noticed. "How long has it been since you smiled like that?" she asked playfully. "I don't know. Maybe since before I got here." "I like that smile," she said, moving closer to him. That night, they kissed for the first time. And the world, for a few moments, seemed safe. But love didn't erase fear. It intensified it. Because Diego knew that sooner or later he'd have to tell her the truth. Not just for honesty's sake, but because the life they were building, although fragile, although uncertain, needed solid foundations. He spent weeks hesitating. What if Emily walked away? What if she thought he had only approached her out of self-interest? What if, worse yet, he put her in danger? One night, while walking across the 6th Street Bridge, with the city shining behind them, Diego stopped. "There's something I have to tell you," he murmured. Emily turned to him, worried. "Whatever it is, tell me." He swallowed hard. He felt the words scraping his throat. "My visa expired years ago. I don't have papers. I've been living in hiding ever since." Emily was silent for a few seconds. She didn't look at him with horror. She didn't pull away. She didn't interrupt him. She just listened. "I've been afraid every day of being arrested, of being deported, of losing everything," Diego continued. "But what scares me most now is losing you." Emily, with tears in her eyes, took his hand. "Thank you for trusting me. You don't have to go through this alone. We'll find a way out, together." Diego felt something inside him break, but not from fear. It was the weight he'd been carrying, finally crumbling. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone, or invisible, or like a fugitive. He felt loved. And in that instant, without knowing it yet, he had begun the process that would turn his world upside down. Diego's confession to Emily had been like releasing a dam. For years, the words had stuck in his throat, held back by fear, by shame, by the conviction that no one could understand his situation without judging him. But Emily didn't reject him. She didn't leave. She didn't turn her back on him. She hugged him tightly and, through tears, told him they would be okay, that she wouldn't leave him alone, that they would find a way out. That night, Diego didn't sleep. Not because he was anxious, but because for the first time in a long time, he felt light. As if the darkness that had enveloped him for years had cracked. The room was still the same, small, hot, with a flickering lamp. But he was different. Inside, something had changed. The following days were a mix of excitement and nervousness. Emily began looking for legal information. She spoke with a lawyer who worked with her organization. She explained to Diego that it wouldn't be easy, but there were possible paths: adjustment of status through marriage, a possible application for cancellation of deportation if detained, even the option of applying for a special visa if it could be proven he had been a victim of labor exploitation. Diego listened to everything attentively, although he found it hard to believe there was a real way out. Fear, still accompanied him, but it was no longer a prison. It was a silent presence that gradually lost strength to something more powerful, hope. One afternoon, while sitting in MacArthur Park, Emily looked directly into his eyes. "Have you thought about marrying me?" The question shook him, not for lack of love, but for what it implied. "Are you saying that for the papers?" Emily smiled sweetly. "I'm saying it because I love you, because I want a life with you. But yes, also for that, I'm not ashamed to say it. If this is the way to help you have a dignified life, why not do it?" Diego looked down. His pride hurt. For so long, he had avoided being one of those who married just to fix their status. But with Emily, it was different. What he felt for her was real, honest. It wasn't a deal or a favor. It was love, real love. "I don't want you to think I'm taking advantage of you," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I'd think that if I didn't love you," Emily responded. "But I love you. And this is what people who love each other do. They help each other. They protect each other." So they began to plan. They looked for documents, witnesses, rent receipts, photos together, everything they needed to prove their relationship was legitimate. They enrolled in a premarital class at a downtown church. They bought 2 simple rings at a local store. They decided to have an intimate wedding without big celebrations, not for lack of love, but for prudence, for safety. Diego began to allow himself things that had previously seemed impossible, going to the dentist, walking without checking every corner, looking to the future without feeling it was a betrayal of reality. Each step was a victory, each small achievement. Holding hands on the street, dining in public, saying his name without fear, was a sign that something was changing. But he was also aware that everything was fragile. That one mistake, one oversight, one misfortune was enough for everything to collapse. That's why, when he received Emily's call at 2 a.m, with a trembling voice and choked words, he knew something wasn't right. "Where are you?" he asked, still half asleep. "You have to come. I'm outside the station. The police arrested you." Diego took a few seconds to understand. He didn't remember going out. He didn't remember doing anything. Until suddenly he remembered everything. That night, he'd gone out to work a few extra hours at a site that needed to be finished before Monday. On his way home, a patrol car stopped him for a broken taillight. He didn't have a license, no papers either. The officer was polite, but firm. Diego didn't argue, he didn't run, he didn't lie. He just handed over his fake ID, which the officer discovered in seconds. He was arrested on the spot, taken to the nearest station, put in ICE custody when his immigration status was confirmed. All because of a damn broken light. Emily had been notified by one of Diego's friends, who saw him being handcuffed and managed to write down the patrol car's license plate number. She called the police, lawyers, her boss. Within hours, she moved heaven and earth to locate him, and now she was there, standing in front of the detention center, crying silently, with the marriage papers in her hand. Diego saw her through the glass during the first visit. Her hair was loose, her face tired, but her eyes full of determination. "We're not giving up," she told him, squeezing his hand through the acrylic. "You're not alone anymore. We're going to fight." Diego felt his whole body trembling, not from fear, from emotion, from gratitude, from love, because even locked up, handcuffed, detained, he had never been so close to being free. If you're enjoying this story, give us a like, subscribe to our channel, and activate notifications to stay up to date with all our content. Diego woke up every day in the detention center with a mix of disbelief and anguish. He couldn't stop thinking about how ironic it all was. He had spent years hiding, watching every step, avoiding any minimal confrontation, and just when he allowed himself to dream of a different life, when love and a possible way out opened up before him, a simple broken taillight had put everything at risk. The cell was cold, gray, dehumanizing. The lights never completely turned off, and guards walked through the hallways every hour. He shared space with other men, most also Latino, some in his same situation, others with darker stories. There wasn't much talking. Most avoided forming bonds, as if establishing a friendship made the separation more painful when deportation came. Emily was the only constant amid the chaos. She didn't miss a single visit or a single call. If the schedule allowed, she was there, with her notebook full of notes, documents organized in colored folders, and that firm look Diego knew well. It was the look of someone who wasn't planning to give up. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. "We already have the marriage application ready," she told him one afternoon, on the other side of the glass. "The lawyer is going to file it this week. It won't be immediate, but it's the first step. If the judge accepts it, they can suspend the deportation while processing the status adjustment." Diego could barely believe what he was hearing. He felt like he was trapped in an emotional roller coaster. He went from hope to despair in minutes. But seeing Emily, so convinced, so solid, brought him calm. It sustained him. "What if they don't accept it?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Then we'll fight again. We'll file appeals, look for other paths. Diego, I'm not leaving. I'm not abandoning you. You're not alone anymore." He lowered his head. He didn't cry in front of the other detainees, but in those visits, when he saw Emily, when he heard her voice, the armor cracked. Tears flowed without permission. Tears of fear, yes, but also of love, of relief, of knowing that after years of living like a ghost, someone saw him, really saw him. The lawyer explained that being in deportation proceedings, they could request a waiver once married, arguing that Diego's expulsion would cause extreme hardship to Emily, a U.S. citizen. It was a difficult path, full of legal obstacles, interrogations, evidence review, but it existed, and that was already more than Diego had ever had. "We're going to need witnesses, letters, proof of the relationship," the lawyer explained, serious but understanding. "Photos, messages, testimonies, everything you have. The judge has to believe this relationship is real." Emily didn't hesitate. She went to the house where Diego rented his room and collected the few belongings he had. A box with printed photos, a couple of letters he had written her by hand, purchase receipts, even a video where they danced at a family gathering. Every detail became proof of love, real love. They got married on a Tuesday afternoon in a small room inside the detention center. The official who married them was brief, almost mechanical, but for them it was sacred. Emily wore a white blouse and jeans, Diego, the beige detention center uniform. There were no rings, no party, no applause, but there was a promise. "I love you," she told him, her eyes full of tears. "No matter how long it takes, no matter what happens, I won't stop until you're free." "I love you," he responded, his voice breaking. "Thank you for giving me back my life." After the ceremony, Emily left to continue fighting with the lawyers and documentation. Diego returned to his cell, but he was no longer the same. For the first time since being detained, he slept deeply. He dreamed of her, of a small house, of a garden, of a table where they could share breakfast without fear. In the following days, Emily gathered more support. Friends, co-workers, community members. Many wrote letters for the judge, speaking of Diego's character, his integrity, how hard he worked, how he helped others without expecting anything in return. The evidence accumulated, one after another, until forming an irrefutable story. Diego wasn't a threat. He was a man who deserved to stay, who had fought with dignity, who had a family. Meanwhile, Diego inside the center helped other detainees fill out forms, translated documents for those who couldn't read, listened to stories that broke his heart. And although his situation was precarious, he felt his life had purpose, that his struggle was part of something bigger. One day, he received a letter from Emily. She had written it by hand, in blue ink. It said, "Sometimes I think the world is against you. that you did everything right, and still they punished you for dreaming. But I want you to know something. They didn't punish you. They're testing you, and you're proving you deserve every part of that freedom we're seeking. I'm with you in every step until we walk hand in hand again, free." Diego read that letter over and over. He kept it under his pillow, and every time fear tried to return, he'd take it out and read it again. Because in the midst of cold walls and bars, that letter was his freedom, his hope. And hope, when born from love, doesn't die easily. The process moved forward, slow, exhausting, full of paperwork and obstacles, but it moved forward. Diego remained detained, and although each day felt eternal, he had learned to resist, not with resignation, but with a mix of faith and stubbornness. He clung to every word from Emily, every promise from the lawyer, every letter he received with messages of encouragement. He knew they were still in the middle of the maze, but for the first time, he felt there was indeed a way out. Emily, for her part, lived a routine of silent war. She worked during the day, attended meetings with the lawyer at night, and spent weekends reviewing documents, making calls, drafting emails. Her life revolved around Diego, not because she had forgotten about hers, but because she had chosen to unite their destinies. She had chosen to fight for him, for both of them. One night, Emily came home particularly exhausted. She had spent the entire day at the immigration office delivering a package of new documents the lawyer considered crucial for the upcoming hearing. It was past 11 when she entered her apartment. She dropped her bag on the sofa, took off her shoes, and, as usual, checked her cell phone for any calls from the detention center. There was nothing, just a message from the lawyer. "There's a new judge assigned to the case. He's stricter. We'll talk tomorrow." Emily stood still. It wasn't good news. The U.S. immigration system isn't uniform. Each judge can interpret the law differently, and many are known for denying applications, even with all documentation in order. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in front of her computer, searching for information about the new judge, reviewing statistics, reading articles, asking in legal forums. Everything she found was discouraging. The next day, she met with the lawyer at his downtown Los Angeles office. "Look, I'm not going to lie to you," he said, showing her the file. "This judge has a very low approval rate. He likes to question everything. He's very rigid with marriage cases. We're going to need a stronger strategy. And a lot of luck." Emily swallowed hard. Is there a possibility he'll order immediate deportation? If he considers the marriage isn't sufficient proof of ties, or that Diego represents a risk? Yes. Emily felt as if the air was escaping from the room. She called Diego that afternoon, but he already knew. The news had spread quickly inside the center. There was something different in his voice, a kind of resignation that broke her heart. "Maybe this was inevitable, you know," he said, trying to sound calm. "Maybe this country was never for me." "Don't say that, please," Emily begged, holding back tears. "We've come too far. You can't give up now." "I'm not giving up," he said, paused. "I'm just preparing myself, just in case." That night, Emily did something she hadn't done in a long time. She allowed herself to cry. Cry from rage, from helplessness, from exhaustion. Not in front of Diego, not in front of anyone. Alone, in her room, with her head in her hands and her heart in pieces. The day of the hearing arrived faster than expected. Emily, dressed in her best formal attire, carried all the organized folders and arrived at the courthouse accompanied by the lawyer and two close friends who would serve as witnesses. Diego, handcuffed and escorted by two agents, was led into the courtroom through a back door. She saw him enter and felt a stab in her stomach. Despite the dark circles and beige uniform, he looked for her with his eyes and smiled at her. That smile was his only armor. The judge was an older man with a severe face and sharp gaze. He read the case aloud, asked witnesses to testify, posed precise, almost aggressive questions. He questioned the speed with which they had decided to marry when they met, the truthfulness of their feelings. Emily responded firmly. She told every detail of their relationship, of the calls, of the walks, of the long nights full of fear and love. "And are you willing to assume the consequences of this process?" the judge asked her. "Even if your husband is deported?" Emily took a deep breath. "Yes, because it's not just about papers. It's about who he is. An honest, hard-working, honorable man. He deserves to be here, with me, with his community." The judge nodded, wrote something on his papers, and adjourned the hearing. The decision would be given in writing in the coming days. The following hours were torture. Diego was returned to the detention center. Emily went home with trembling hands. Sleeping was impossible. Eating, a mechanical task. Waiting, unbearable. 2 days later, at 3 in the morning, Emily's phone rang. It was a call from the detention center. She answered with her heart in her throat. On the other end, a familiar voice. Diego's, broken but alive. "Emily, the judge suspended the deportation. We can continue with the process. I'm free for now." She said nothing. She just cried. She cried as if her soul was leaving through her throat. She cried for everything they had endured, for everything that was still left, but above all, for what that moment meant. It wasn't the end. But for the first time, it wasn't the end either. Diego's call came like a jolt of electricity in the darkness. Emily had gotten used to nights of waiting, sleeping with her cell phone in hand, insomnia dressed as anxiety. But that early morning, hearing Diego's voice confirming that the judge had suspended the deportation, she felt as if the world stopped for a second, as if time breathed. "I'm free, for now," he had said. Those last words kept spinning in her mind like a warning. It wasn't a definitive victory, just a reprieve, an opportunity, a thin thread they now had to hold on to with all their strength. The next morning, Emily showed up at the lawyer's office before they even opened. She carried under her arm a folder with new documents she had prepared during the night, additional proof of their cohabitation, testimonies from neighbors, letters from friends, receipts of money transfers to Diego's family in Mexico. She wasn't going to leave any flank exposed. The lawyer received her with a mix of surprise and respect. He had learned over the days that Emily wasn't like other petitioners. She didn't ask for favors, she demanded justice, and she was willing to wear herself out completely in the process. "Now, the hardest part begins," the lawyer said, reviewing the papers. "The judge suspended the deportation, but that just means we can start the status adjustment. ICE is going to watch Diego very closely. He can't make even the slightest mistake. Everything must be in order." Emily nodded without blinking. "Tell me what we need to do." Meanwhile, Diego was released under immigration supervision. He couldn't work formally yet. He couldn't leave the state. He had to appear for periodic interviews with ICE officers, sign documents, provide constant proof of his whereabouts. They put an electronic ankle monitor on him for the first few days. Every step he took was monitored, but still, he was free. Free to see the sky without bars, to breathe without orders, to hug Emily for the first time in weeks. That first hug upon leaving the detention center was long, silent, full of tears. There were no words, just skin against skin, hearts beating like drums, and a sun that, for the first time in a long time, seemed to shine just for them. "Thank you for not letting go," Diego whispered. "I never would," Emily replied. In the days that followed, life became a race against time. Emily organized meetings with other lawyers to review every point of the case. Diego, still afraid, began preparing his personal statement. It wasn't easy. He had to relive every painful moment, the nights sleeping in fear, the years without medical care, the silent insults, the loss of his identity. "I don't want it to seem like I'm playing the victim," he told Emily one night, while they rehearsed his testimony. "It's not playing the victim," she replied. "It's telling the truth, and your truth deserves to be heard." In parallel, they faced daily challenges that gave no respite. Diego couldn't work legally, and that left them in a delicate financial situation. Emily asked for an advance at work, reduced expenses, sold her bicycle, and still, every dollar counted. They started living in a small one-bedroom apartment in El Sereno, with borrowed furniture and a refrigerator that was often half empty. But they were together, and that was enough. "It doesn't matter if we eat beans all week," Emily would say, smiling as she served dinner. "This tastes better than any restaurant." Diego offered to do repairs in neighborhood houses in exchange for whatever they could give. He painted walls, repaired roofs, fixed leaks. Some paid him in cash, others with food or help. It wasn't much, but it made him feel useful. Every visit to the courthouse was an emotional test. The halls of the federal building were full of families like theirs, all with the same mix of hope and desperation. Some came out smiling, with approval letters in hand. Others crying, with immediate departure orders. One day, while waiting for a preliminary hearing, they saw a young woman exit the courtroom with her child in her arms. She was crying silently. Her husband had just been deported. Emily approached and offered her a tissue. The woman could barely thank her. It was a brutal reminder of what was at stake. "That could have happened to us," Diego whispered. "But it didn't," Emily replied, "and it won't." The case progressed, step by step, witness after witness, document after document. Diego attended all interviews. He complied with all conditions. He kept his records spotless. He had learned to live under a new kind of pressure, one that didn't come from fear of being detained, but from fear of losing this second chance that had cost them so much to build. But there was also light on the path. Emily and Diego found a new community at a cultural center that offered counseling to immigrant families. There, they met other couples who had gone through similar processes. They shared stories, tears, hugs, strategies. They weren't alone. They never had been, really. They just now knew it. One day, leaving one of the interviews, Emily looked at Diego and took his hand. "Do you realize what we're doing?" "What?" "We're beating fear." He smiled. He said nothing. But that night, as they lay on the mattress on the floor, he stared at the ceiling for a long time, his heart beating hard. For the first time in a long time, he didn't think about what they could lose. He thought about everything they could still gain. The day of the final hearing arrived with a strange calm. Diego woke up before the sun, showered in silence, dressed in the only formal shirt he had, the same one he had worn for his wedding to Emily inside the detention center, and looked at himself in the mirror for long minutes. He didn't quite recognize himself, not on the outside, but inside. He was no longer the man who lived in shadows, who crossed the street to avoid a patrol car, who slept with his backpack ready to escape at night. He was someone else, someone who, despite fear, had learned to stand tall. Emily was waiting for him in the kitchen with hot coffee and 2 pieces of toast. They didn't eat much breakfast. Words didn't come easily. Everything they had to say to each other had already been said in recent months, in their looks, in their gestures, in the shared nights and silent tears. "No matter what happens," she said as they left the apartment, "I'm with you." Diego nodded. He didn't trust his voice. If he said something, he might break. They arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes early. The federal building seemed more imposing than ever. It was gray, cold, with guards at every corner and unknown faces full of anxiety. There were people of all ages, nationalities, stories, all fighting to stay, to not disappear. The lawyer met them in the lobby with a serious but encouraging expression. "You have a strong case. You have evidence, witnesses, consistency. The judge knows you. We've done everything possible. Now we just have to hope he listens with his heart, not just with the law." They entered the courtroom. The judge, the same one who had suspended the deportation weeks earlier, was leafing through documents without looking up. There was an ICE officer present, a court translator, and a secretary typing non-stop. Everything seemed straight out of a movie, but for Diego, it was the climax of a battle that had begun years ago in silence. Emily was the first to speak. She did so with the same firmness as always, but with a sweetness that filled the room. She told how they met, how they fell in love, how they had faced every obstacle together. She spoke of their fears, yes, but also of their love, of the deep respect she felt for Diego, of her desire to form a family with him, to build a life together, not under forced conditions, but as a voluntary act of love and commitment. Then it was Diego's turn. The lawyer had told him to be honest, clear, direct, not to embellish anything, to speak from his truth, and that's what he did. I came to this country with a valid visa, with the intention of studying and working. I did. I graduated. But when my visa expired, I didn't find a legal way out in time. I didn't hide by choice. I hid because the system didn't offer me another option. I worked in construction, paid taxes with an ITIN, helped my community, sent money to my family. I'm not a criminal. I'm not a threat. I just want to live without fear. I want to keep building, not just buildings, but a life next to the woman I love. The judge observed him in silence. He asked some technical questions. He reviewed documents. Then he called for a recess to deliberate. During that wait, Diego and Emily stayed in an empty hallway, holding hands. They didn't speak. They couldn't. Every minute was a blow to the chest. The lawyer paced back and forth, murmuring to himself. Outside, the city continued its rhythm as if nothing was happening. But for them, the world had stopped. When they were finally called back, Diego felt the air weigh twice as much. He sat down without looking directly at the judge, fearing that reading his eyes would ruin the decision. The judge spoke in a firm, measured voice. I have carefully reviewed every document, every testimony, every piece of evidence presented. This case has not been easy. It hasn't been since the beginning. But there is something that cannot be ignored. The consistency between what you say and what you do. The commitment shown by this couple, the honesty with which they have conducted their process, and the applicant's willingness to face the consequences of his decisions. He paused and Diego held his breath. Therefore, this court has decided to definitively suspend the deportation proceedings and authorize the formal initiation of status adjustment for Mr. Diego Ramirez under the category of spouse of a U.S. citizen. Emily covered her mouth with her hands. Diego didn't understand immediately. It was the lawyer who touched his arm and said quietly, "We won." Then Diego released the air he had been holding for days, years maybe. He didn't cry loudly. He didn't scream. He just closed his eyes and let the tears fall as if they were part of a silent thaw. Emily hugged him tightly. There were no applause. There was no music. Just the sound of a broken heart that finally was beginning to heal. Upon leaving the building, Diego stopped at the entrance, took a deep breath, and looked at the sky. For the first time, the Los Angeles sky didn't seem foreign to him. It wasn't the roof of a hostile country. It was the sky under which at last he could walk without hiding. There were still procedures left. He still needed residency, interviews, forms. But that day, they had crossed an invisible line. They were no longer at the mercy of fear. They were on the other side. At home, Emily took out a small bottle of wine she had saved for that moment and poured it into plastic cups. They toasted in silence. Then, Diego took his phone, opened the front camera, and looked at himself. "Who are you?" he asked quietly with a half-smile. Emily came closer, kissed his cheek, and answered, "You're a free man." Months passed since the judge's decision, and although there was still road ahead, Diego's life was no longer the same. Fear didn't disappear completely. Some wounds take time to heal. But it became a distant shadow, something that no longer directed his steps. Now, at last, he walked forward. Without hiding, without bowing his head, he received his temporary work permit 3 months after the ruling. The first thing he did was go to a local print shop to print business cards with his real name, Diego Ramirez, construction and structural design technician. When he held them in his hands, his eyes moistened. Not for the cardboard, but for what it meant. For every time he had to use a fake name, for every time he denied himself to survive. Emily accompanied him to his first job interview with legal documents. It wasn't a big company or an important position, but they hired him on the spot. A Salvadoran contractor welcomed him with a pat on the back. "Your story sounds familiar. We all started from some corner of fear. The important thing is not to stay there." Diego started working legally the following week. The first complete and declared paycheck he received, he framed it. Not for the money, which wasn't much, but because it was proof he no longer lived in the shadows. Within a few months, with Emily's help, they rented a small apartment in Highland Park with an American kitchen, 2 east-facing windows, and a washing machine that made a horrible noise but worked. They signed the lease in his name, Diego Ramirez. It was the first time in years he signed something without fear. Every letter was a victory. "Don't you want to change your clothes?" Emily asked one afternoon when they were going to the bank to open his first bank account. "I want them to see me as I am," he replied, with his plaster-stained shirt and worn work boots. The bank employee offered him coffee while they filled out the forms. Diego trembled slightly as he wrote his temporary social security number, as if he still feared someone would stop him. But no one did. No one questioned him. They left the bank with a card in hand and the smile of someone who's starting to exist officially. Then came the small things. Basic health insurance. Enrollment in an advanced English class at a community school. A Spotify subscription Diego had wanted for years but could never pay for with his own card. They started planning simple vacations, a trip to San Diego, a getaway to Santa Barbara. Nothing luxurious, but real. Later, they applied together for a subsidized housing program. They didn't know if they'd be accepted, but for the first time they could try. Emily got back on her bike. Diego bought her a new helmet and a taillight, with silent irony. That same light at another time had changed his life. And now, a simple light represented something different. Protection, path, direction. One morning, Diego woke up before Emily. He made coffee, put on soft music, and sat on the small balcony of the apartment with his notebook. He started drawing, plans, ideas, sketches of small structures, recycled concrete chairs, park benches. He wanted to study urban design. He wanted, someday, to create spaces for the homeless, for the invisible, because he knew how that felt, and he didn't want anyone else to carry that feeling. Emily hugged him from behind, kissed his neck, and stayed silent, looking at his drawings. "Do you know what you are now?" she whispered. "What? A man who doesn't just survive, a man who dreams, who builds, who inspires." He looked at her without saying anything. He smiled. On Sundays, they started going together to community fairs, the same ones where they met, this time not as visitors but as volunteers. Diego helped set up tents, explain basic labor rights, tell his story to those still living in fear. He wasn't a hero, he said, just someone who had resisted. "What if they had deported me?" he sometimes asked, thoughtfully. "Then I would have started over there," he'd answer himself. But this time not with fear, with memory, with dignity. One day, he received a letter with the seal of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Emily opened it with trembling hands. Diego remained motionless. They didn't breathe for seconds. It was the approval of his green card, permanent residency. "You're a resident now, Diego," Emily said, her voice cracking. He said nothing. He just hugged her, as if that paper were the last piece of an emotional puzzle, as if with that, at last, he could close a chapter that had lasted almost a decade. And he did, not because everything was easy now, not because the ghosts disappeared overnight, but because he had crossed the threshold. because now he could build his story without hiding it. That night, he walked through downtown Los Angeles, hand in hand with Emily, under the yellow lights and shadows of buildings that once scared him. They passed in front of a parked patrol car. Diego looked at it, breathed deeply, and kept walking, not with fear, but with freedom. And if you liked this story, you'll surely love the next one that appears on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like, and activate notifications. See you next time.